Welcome. My name is Gerald Newman, and I'm one of the directors of the Human Rights Program at Harvard Law School. And we are delighted and privileged to be able to present to you today Victor Madrigal-Borloz, who is the UN Independent Expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and who very fortunately is also the Eleanor Roosevelt Senior Visiting Researcher at the Human Rights Program. He's going to talk today about the problem of discrimination and violence in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, a subject on which he has presented a report to the United Nations in the fall. He'll be talking for about half an hour, and that will leave plenty of time for questions and answers. And so I want to direct your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your webinar screen. If questions come to you while he's speaking or after, once we've opened the question and answer period, please type your questions there. The questions won't be answered in writing, but we'll try to answer as many of those questions during the question and answer period. We're very interested in having an interactive, it's a very substantial interactive portion for this event. So thank you, and without more, I will give the word to Victor.
Thank you so much, Jerry, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you wherever you are in these difficult times that we are going through. I hope that you are doing well and that you're staying safe. I want to thank very warmly Professor Gerald Newman and the Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program for their support in not only, of course, my work as a visiting researcher, but in particular to promote the knowledge and the awareness around the issues that have been identified in this report of the mandate of the independent expert on protection from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. A mandate that was created in the belief, in the understanding that to increase awareness of the problematic faced by lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender diverse persons around the world, to increase awareness of that problematic, there would be increased political will and political capital to adopt measures that are effective in addressing and combating the heinous levels of violence and discrimination that we know those persons face every day in countries around the world. Now, the mandate has existed, as many of you would know, since 2016, 2017, and I have been the mandate holder since 2018. Since that moment, we have been able to explore issues concerning root causes that lie at the origin of this manifestation of violence and discrimination, and that include the ever-present problem of criminalization, legal recognition of gender identity, and all of the forms of stigma, institutionalized stigma, that actually lie at the base of violence against LGBT persons. But 2020 threw us, as we all know, a curveball. In the midst of what was already a significant set of challenges faced by LGBT people around the world, the COVID-19 pandemic created, since its very early moments, a suspicion that the persons that belonged to sexual and gender diversity came to it from a point of view of disadvantage. And therefore, the mandate of the independent expert that I have the honor to carry through made it its purpose to actually investigate the manner in which COVID-19 pandemic was deploying, if at all, separate, disparate, or particular impact on the LGBT population. And we made it our intent, therefore, to make it so that the report that I presented in 2020 to the General Assembly of the United Nations would actually have that particular thematic approach. The dedication of the thematic drive is actually inscribed into this particular understanding of the approach to the mandate. I always place a human person in the middle of this diagram because I want to make sure that in every action that I take, I always remember that I am trying to produce impact that benefits this person's ability to pursue happiness and to use the tools that are available to her to do that. So in a way, what you could imagine is that the work of the mandate is trying to impact that person that is in the middle multiplied 7 billion times. To the left of this person, you see the work of increasing visibility of violence and discrimination, in this particular case, to identify how violence and discrimination manifested itself in interaction with the COVID-19 pandemic. And to the right, as indirect correlation with the knowledge that we gain of how violence and discrimination manifest themselves, the identification of good practice that allows us to produce advice to states on effective measures of legislative, access to justice, and public policy nature. We do that through a series of means that include my work on country visits, my work on cases of allegation of human rights violations, and of course my research, which is the way that I have produced this particular report that I presented to the General Assembly. The drafting process to the report took us through a series of months in which the academic inquiry was taken forward. On March 27 of last year, I sent an open letter to the LGBT community around the world, expressing my need to obtain inputs as to the manner in which COVID-19 was deploying particular impact in the lived realities of all persons belonging to these communities, populations, and peoples. And during April and May, we held a series of virtual consultations open to all stakeholders. On May 17, an unprecedented historic statement was issued by 96 experts on the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, in which it called upon governments and all stakeholders to maintain LGBT people visible when it came to pandemic response and recovery. We then issued at the end of May a joint call for inputs about the COVID-19 pandemic. And on June 18 of that year, I launched the Aspire guidelines, a byproduct of the research effort through which I called upon states and all stakeholders to ensure that LGBT people and their existence would be acknowledged, that LGBT organizations would be supported, that LGBT people would be protected from persecution in the context of COVID-19 response and recovery, that indirect discrimination would be assessed as a real risk of impact of pandemic response and recovery, that representation of LGBT people would be key to ensure appropriateness in pandemic response and recovery. And finally, I called upon governments to maintain evidence-based approaches. These 6 principles creating the acronym of Aspire. During July and August, I drafted the report, and in October, I issued it and I presented it to the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, through this endeavor, over 100 reports and essays were reviewed, over 1,000 individuals from more than 100 countries were heard. I received 86 contributions in response to a joint call for inputs, of which 55 were solely and specific to the independent experts mandate, that is in particular to sexual orientation and gender identity. Here you can see the way that the submissions reflected regional realities, significant contributions from Latin America and the Caribbean, Western Europe, from global angle, Eastern Europe and Asia Pacific, and an ever-present concern in relation to the way the mandate receives information, represented by Africa, which is always, in my view, underrepresented when it comes to the creation of knowledge bases for the mandate in what concerns sexual orientation and gender identity. By stakeholders, we received an overwhelming amount of submissions from civil society organizations, a few by states, including national human rights institutions, and a few by UN agencies and academics. But here we see the weight that of the burden that is carried out by civil society in maintaining an accurate evidence base in what concerns particular problematic of faced by LGBT persons around the world. To the key findings. I would like to share with you that the first finding of the report is that indeed the COVID-19 pandemic has created disproportionate impact on lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans persons. And with very few exceptions, the response to the pandemic reproduces and exacerbates patterns of social exclusion and violence that had already been identified by the mandate. This means that in the sectors of education, employment, health, housing, political participation, and all other sectors of participation in public life, LGBT persons have seen that pandemic response and recovery have exacerbated the factors that exclude them from effective participation from participation in the social fabric, and in particular from benefiting from measures adopted by states in this connection. Some of the main human rights concerns that actually were reproduced and were identified in relation to these issues actually related to, as I mentioned, exacerbated factors of exclusion. But I would like to share with you that I actually found, as a first line of conclusion, a significant and very worrisome trend that allowed me to conclude that certain governments actually utilized the COVID-19 pandemic as an excuse to actually persecute and adopt actions of persecution against LGBT persons, and in a way, make politically or practically possible measures that in a situation where they wouldn't have the sweeping emergency powers that they had under the pandemic, to actually utilize these sweeping powers to actually enact persecution and limitations against LGBT persons. I received, for example, a claim of raids carried out in shelters that were specifically serving LGBT communities, and that under the pretext of pandemic response, they were raided and persons living in the shelter were arrested, when in reality, upon examination of the circumstances of the specific case, it became very clear to me that it had been a measure where a local government, this was in Uganda, where the local government had decided to use the possibility afforded by the pandemic to persecute the gay persons that were indeed actually sheltering in this place. I'm also on the record expressing significant concern by the passing of legislation restricting the ability of trans persons to obtain legal recognition in Hungary, legislation that was passed under the powers afforded by to the government by the emergency of the pandemic response, when in reality, this goes against the logic of the evidence that we know, which is that in the cases of emergency, it becomes ever so much more important for trans persons to have documents that represent and correspond to their gender expression rather than the opposite, which is what the Hungarian government was indeed carried through in this infamous legislation now already passed through Parliament. So, first worrisome trend found as a conclusion in my report is that pandemic response and the existence of the pandemic was utilized as an excuse from and by governments to enact measures of limitation and persecution against LGBT persons in different contexts around the world, something where I expect that both my mandate and other entities will be following up on systematically, given that those measures are, of course, subject to examination in what concerns their proportionality, their legality, and their necessity in relation to the pandemic. A second line of conclusion in my report related to the impact of measures that were designed as neutral measures and that one could not identify at the outset as measures constituting persecution or limitations particularly aimed at discriminating against LGBT persons, but that in their functioning, and in particular because of their interaction with the lived realities of LGBT persons, they ended up deploying particular impact, particular damage to LGBT populations, communities, and persons. Stay-at-home directives, isolation, increased stress and exposure to disrespectful family members exacerbate the risk of violence with particular impact on older persons and youths. I had access to a recent survey, for example, in Iran, that found that more than 50% of respondents had experienced increased violence, and submissions concerning European populations reported an increase in domestic violence in a majority of the surveyed countries. Youths and elder persons that were in a way forced to return to larger family contexts found this limitation significant, particularly when these families' environments were not respectful or accepting of their sexual orientation and their gender identity. And practicalities such as sharing computer equipment, sharing spaces in which conversations are audible, and sharing spaces visually accessible exacerbated the risk of exposure and the reality of violence and exclusion. And these are issues in relation to which I have received significant number of information throughout my research and follow-up process. Now, another manifestation of what one could qualify as indirect discrimination was represented by gender-based quarantines, where certain governments, particularly in Latin America, decided to restrict freedom of movement and the ability of persons to go onto public space based on their registered sex. At the outset, it would not necessarily appear that such a measure would create disparate impact, but a gender-based lens immediately was able to determine what verified itself in reality as a very problematic implementation. Only in the most general of ways, when one puts a gender-based lens, it resulted absolutely immediate to people that the streets were equally crowded on the days in which women were allowed to go out. And that is because in those countries in Latin America, it is women who disproportionately take charge of actually doing the work of going and buying the groceries and doing the family errands. Whereas during the day in which men were allowed to be occupying public space, it was mostly seen that those were being occupied to actually attend social gatherings in public space. Significantly problematic if one is to actually understand the sanitary intent of the measure. But it created a perhaps less suspected, but more immediate and more urgent impact on gender diverse persons whose gender expression does not correspond with the documents. It created significant opportunities that verified themselves in very problematic cases for people to be harassed by police, to be actually stopped on the street, or basically to be fearful of those instances and therefore not being able to go out of their homes to accede to health programs and to basically buy their groceries or buy their commodities that they needed for different aspects of their lives. And this was very problematic, and my mandate went, of course, on record expressing some of the problems that these gender-based quarantines were creating. And the reason why it is fundamental, I respond to this, it is fundamental that this type of measures be taken in consultation with the communities that they're going to impact. And that is because they interact with dynamics in these communities and, of course, create disparate impact in all of those. Some of the aspects are, of course, common to the generality of the population due to socioeconomic instability, inability to leave abusive environments, aggravation of anxiety and other pre-existing conditions related to mental and emotional well-being. LGBT persons, like other persons historically subjected to discrimination, have suffered significant impact from the pandemic. Services have reported a perception of deteriorating mental health and increased demands for psychological assistance. And one submission before my mandate revealed a fourfold increase in instances in which a caller was contemplating suicide, something that, of course, is enormously worrisome to my mandate. The third line of inquiry and conclusion in my report relates to the fact that LGBT persons, like other populations and communities historically subjected to discrimination, came to the pandemic in a field that was not level. LGBT persons, we now know, are disproportionately represented in the ranks of the poor, in the ranks of those experiencing homelessness, and those without proper health care, meaning that they are particularly impacted as a result of the challenges created by the pandemic. In particular, LGBT persons disproportionately rely on informal sector activity for income. And even when formally employed, they are more likely to work in industries that are highly disrupted by the pandemic. For example, restaurants and food service, retail and grooming, public sector education, hospitals, and sex work. LGBT persons experiencing homelessness are now compelled to rely on social housing and shelter programs that are not safe for stigmatized populations. And even as late into the pandemic response and recovery as today, I was in an earlier meeting discussing with a colleague who let me know that refugee and asylum seekers who are LGBT are facing significant problems in shelters that are run by faith-based organizations that may not be accepting of their identities or orientations. LGBT persons also face the dilemma of living in cramped communal spaces, which creates significant health concerns. And as we expressed, face the alternative of being compelled to return to hostile families and communities. The realities created by this pandemic response and by this pandemic recovery measures is complex. And like perhaps never before, we are able to say that COVID-19 is a problematic that has left no person in the planet unaffected. But we also know that affectation met people that were prepared very differently. The overrepresentation of LGBT persons amongst the rank of the poor has meant that LGBT persons typically do not have access to savings, and they may have significant challenges in accessing credit. Their reliance on informal sector activity means that they will face significant challenges in accessing public financial aid. And indeed, their situation of rupture, particularly of gender diverse persons and trans persons with formalized health and employment sectors, will mean that access to help and even the vaccine will be maimed by enormous challenges that are tainted by that particular informality and that situation of rupture. This is the reason, dear friends, dear colleagues, why I issued the Aspire guidelines. Because the thrust of my recommendations to states actually was reflected on those 6 principles of acknowledging, supporting, protecting, assessing indirect discrimination, ensuring representation and evidence-based approaches. And so part of what I recommended to states was to give visibility to LGBT lives in public policy, to deconstructing stigma and protecting LGBT persons from violence and discrimination, and to designing state response based on evidence and with the involvement of LGBT organizations. The reality created by the pandemic is stark also in terms of the support and the resources available to organizations that are LGBT-led and LGBT supporting. And part of what I'm hoping to make visible is the very particular challenges that will necessitate for this organization to receive support. I see this report as part of a continuum of action, one where I'm hoping that the evidence base created by the report and all submissions to it, all of the consultation process, will also be met with a follow-through process during pandemic recovery, which is why I am very much hoping that interaction around this issue will continue for the 2 or 3 years that I continue being the mandate holders. We now know enough about the pandemic to know that we will need to continue with particular attention to the problematic that it has created for years to come. And this is why I am, of course, making a call for all of those involved in policy making, access to justice, law reform, civil society action, and in general, human rights advocacy, to maintain an emphasis in understanding how this pandemic has impacted LGBT persons around the world and how we must all work together in ensuring that we address that impact in our everyday activities. Dear friends, you've all been very kind with your time and your attention. I do hope that some of you will be interested in now engaging in a conversation about how we can clarify any concepts in which I have not been clear enough, expand on others, or to actually have a conversation about how we continue this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We do have a few questions that have already come in. I'd like to start with one that is legal in nature. If I could phrase it this way, what are the international legal sources that push through sovereignty to create legal obligations of states to protect the rights of LGBTQI and gender diverse persons during a pandemic?
Thank you very much. That is, of course, a very interesting question, both from the legal and from the political angle. Generally, from the legal angle, it is understood that international human rights law standards are part of the legal structure that creates obligations to states, and that may be claimed both at domestic and within international venues. And to that respect, there is a very well-established theory and construction that guides the way international law and domestic law interact to create a coherent whole. Of course, all of this depends on a series of conditions that include the way in which international law is created. This is, of course, hardcore international law, and it relates to the way in which treaties are formed, the way in which states accede to treaties, and also the way in which norms of international law that are acknowledged as universally applicable, what we know as jus cogens, is formed under certain conditions. That is the legal aspect. And in that understanding, there is very little that could be said in terms of incoherence between international and domestic law. But of course, there are manners in which states apply international law that belong to what is known as margins of appreciation or attributions of execution of international law. And this is part of a complex legal theory acknowledged, of course, by international tribunals and so on and so forth. That's the legal aspect. But the political aspect is equally important, and that is that in the international political narrative, very often states will claim that human rights obligations should not interfere with their spaces of sovereignty, and that human rights, international human rights, should not interfere with the way that their domestic system is established. And this is particularly important in my field because there is still a significant 69 countries around the world that actually criminalize homosexuality or lesbianism or some forms of gender identity. 9 of them with the death penalty. And it is very, very often the case that in those contexts, those countries say that international law should not interfere with their possibility to punish people with the death penalty for being gay, or to actually whip them in a public market and then video the whipping and putting the whipping on social media. I think that this is the political side of the argument that is actually quite significant, again, in political discourses, oftentimes within the womb of the United Nations human rights and other bodies. And this had an impact also in COVID-19 response and recovery, because as you can imagine, criminalized contexts in which persons actually are in fear of being prosecuted, you would be under significant challenges and constraints to disclose to the person that you're seeking to receive a family food package from, that that food package is destined to a household where you live with your same-sex partner, for example. Or you would hesitate to mention to the community leader that your same-sex partner is actually suffering some sort of fever while being at home, the home that you share. You can see immediately the particular impact of criminalization and the narratives concerning criminalization and the way it connects with sovereignty and protection of issues such as so-called traditional values and so on and so forth. The limit to sovereignty is given by what is known as a human rights-based approach, which is clearly the idea that measures that are adopted within an emergency are subject to a vigorous, robust framework given under international law, which means that they must be necessary, they must be proportional to the emergency, they must be operating within a legal framework, and part of that is also that they must be justified, meaning that they must undergo an examination in relation to time and form and modality in order to be considered valid under international human rights law.
Thank you for that framework explanation. Here's a different kind of question. I'm going to combine two questions, I think, in asking this. Generally speaking, in addition to all the negative things that we have seen in the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been some acceleration of innovative policymaking in some areas. Have you identified any promising interventions to advance the rights of LGBTQI under the COVID pandemic? And more specifically, one question asked, proposed policies that can help increase the safety nets for LGBTQ individuals that might not have the family supports. Has that been going on in countries?
Yeah, that is, of course, a wonderful question. I'm very grateful for it. Yes, significant good practice has been identified all throughout. I can give some examples. Let me first allude to the idea of suspension of evictions. Argentina was a pioneer in that type of measure. And I was, I have to say, impressed and even surprised at the speed in which this type of measure was adopted in two regions of Argentina and then in the overall country. Within 24 hours of the declaration of public emergency in Argentina, there was a regulation circulated in terms of public policy declaring a moratorium on evictions that would impact trans women. Why is this so important? And why was it so important that it was done so fast? Trans women don't have access to credit. And in general, I would say that uh, I would not be worried about making a mistake if I say that 99% of women in Argentina, trans women, do not have, not only not have access to credit, but also not have any savings. It's a huge proportion. I've received a submission to that respect. It's in the high 90%. And they rely disproportionately also on sex work to actually have their daily income. The precariousness of their everyday situation means that they probably will have their homes paid by the day or by the week. They probably don't have monthly contracts to actually occupy their homes. And when the emergency was declared and when curfews were declared, it probably meant that from one moment to the next, those trans persons that were relying on sex work to actually have their income would see their income absolutely stop, the flows of their income absolutely stop from one moment to the next. And the freeze in moratoriums probably meant the difference between a significant number of trans women becoming absolutely vulnerable in terms of situations of homelessness within one moment to the next. So moratoriums in evictions, I think, was a significant measure that I saw working very well. Second example of measures that, in my view, were extraordinarily effective related to the disproportionate impact on elder and young persons that were forced to stay at home. Now, we all know the realities of mental health that have been created by stay-at-home directives, and they have affected the generality of the population. But particular understanding of the way that they affected different communities, populations, and peoples has been, I am sure, a lifesaver. And in Spain, for example, there was the measure of creating immediately hotlines of attention of LGBT youth and elder LGBT persons that were in situations of anguish and exacerbated mental health problems created by stay-at-home directives. This was, in my view, a significant measure that was actually quite extraordinary. All of those two actually carried out in significant part, of course, as state responses. Let me give you a third example, and with that, I will finish these examples, but there are many. There are many good practices that have come throughout the pandemic. The third example relates to a problematic that was found very early on about the engagement of faith-based leaders and community leaders in the chains of distribution of food and health supplies. Because community and faith-based leaders are so close to the communities, they usually know who is gay and who's lesbian and who's trans. And I began to receive denunciations in different parts of the world where these leaders were actually denying persons access to these packages of supplies because of their sexual orientation and their gender identity. And in different contexts, particularly in African and Asian countries, it became very fast that then governments started to adopt the measure of requiring that those involved in chain distributions would be signing a commitment to non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in the context of the pandemic. And the reason why I'm not being very specific in relation to some of these contexts is that some of them, interestingly enough, were operating in contexts of criminalization, where one could argue that it is the state-led policy to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And yet there was an understanding of the importance of adopting state-supported policies that would acknowledge the importance of non-discriminating on those levels. And I found that actually quite fascinating as an exercise of reality in terms of the way that non-discrimination works. The last point that I would like to make in relation to this is not only all responses were state-led, and I want to pay tribute in this moment to the extraordinary work of the robust and vigorous network of civil society organizations that exist around the world and that over the last 40 years have created a vibrant system of support, hundreds and thousands of individuals and organizations that operate as a neural network of support, providing comfort and relief to LGBT people around the world. And the work of civil society has operated in terms of support that has been of the most concrete nature for people, and they activated themselves from day one to provide this type of support. And from the most concrete, which was to elaborate food packages. I myself, the other day in my home country of Costa Rica, witnessed an organization actually continuing to creating food packages for those in need within the community, to the most sophisticated manifestations, which is the organizations that have the ability and the network to operate at a global scale and created exercises of micro grants or sub grants. This is the case, for example, of Outright International or Thyssen within the Commonwealth setting, organizations that created sub-granting facilities to provide micro grants that kept the lights on in these organizations, that kept the phone lines being paid. Sometimes as much as $100 would make a difference between the organization continuing to receive calls or not. And of course, other networks and organizations such as ILGA, which immediately deployed, and Outright International as well, GATE, which immediately deployed, along with organizations that operate in specialized fields like COC Netherlands, and others, particular research efforts that brought visibility to the pandemic. So all of that has been an extraordinarily complex and rich set of responses to the pandemic, where we will be able to learn in the future, of course, as well.
Thank you. Could you comment on how LGBT persons have been impacted in their access to justice to address violations in the context of COVID-19, particularly with regard to access to courts?
Well, very quickly to provide you with 3 levels of ideas of how this works. The first one is, of course, I always need to make this point, criminalized environments. Anything that would relate to a particular exacerbation of factors would be deeply impacted by the reality that in criminalized environments, LGBT people have a predisposition to access the formal system. So that's always a determinant, and it's exacerbated in COVID-19 situations. The second one is the reality that in many of these contexts, law enforcement officers have operated historically and have exacerbated that operation within the pandemic as themselves being factors of violence and discrimination. So the horrifying images of a video produced in Peru where 3 trans women were vilified by policemen, their clothes were taken off, they were compelled to jump up and down, screaming, "I'm a man, I'm a man, I'm a man, and I want to receive punishment for my nature." That particular image was filmed by a police officer and was demanded and operated by a police officer. So that particular connection with the justice sector is a reality even in environments that are not criminalized. The generality of the population has seen access to justice restricted by the sheer reality that tribunals and courthouses have been closed, and virtual spaces are predetermined by socioeconomic status. acceding to a space that is virtual requires an internet connection and requires computer equipment. It also requires the possibility of being in a space where you can discuss your private affairs without being heard. All of these realities deeply impacted by poverty in a way that necessitates, of course, intersectional analysis of the many, many aspects, including sexual orientation and gender identity, that reunite themselves in one body to create an experience of discrimination.
Thank you. Can I ask, what have been some of the patterns or trends, I'll add either positive or negative, in regard to states' data collection regarding COVID-19 information about LGBTQI communities?
Well, I'm going to begin with the negative because unfortunately it's the most. I have constantly reaffirmed the notion that data collection and management suffers from significant challenges when it comes to LGBT persons. The reality is that my mandate operates in a series of contexts where the very existence of LGBT persons is denied, where members of the government will say that LGBT persons do not exist. And therefore, in those contexts, data gathering is just not possible as a reality by the government. And in other contexts, the challenges to actually produce and disaggregate data are overwhelming. I would say, again, this is a fictitious figure, but I'll give it that in 95% of the contexts around the world, in a vast majority of contexts around the world, let me put it that way, data collection just doesn't happen at all. COVID-19 just came to exacerbate that. COVID-19 came to exacerbate the reality that we know so little about the lived realities of LGBT persons. And it came to exacerbate the realities that it's a burden that falls disproportionately on the shoulders, so to speak, of civil society. Organizations that dedicate themselves to gather data to the best of their ability, which oftentimes are superb in terms of competence and integrity, but do not have necessarily the continuity and the resource base that state-led efforts have. So the challenges are enormous. And if you look at my report, you will see that a significant part of my findings have had to rely on evidence that is anecdotal, because the reality is that data and data that possesses quality and integrity is not coming from many parts of the world. I mentioned, for example, the realities in the African inputs, and that I think would be a part that we need to work upon quite strongly.
Thank you. There has been a rich set of questions, and unfortunately, we don't have time to deal in any depth with all of them. I think I'd like to end with one last question, which looks toward a positive note, which is the theme of building back better. There's a lot of talk about, what we've learned from the pandemic and how we need to have openness, not just to going back to the way things were before, but to building back better. What structural reforms would you recommend that would contribute to end violence and discrimination against our LGBT plus community members?
Thank you, Jerry, warmly for your kindness and your facilitation, and also for this question. Let me preface that by saying that we will, of course, take note. I will ask our dear colleague Marie whether we can make note of all of the questions, and I will answer all of them offline. I'll be very happy to do that in writing to those who have chosen to identify themselves. I'll take 60 seconds for my answer. What is extraordinary to me is the fact that we know that LGBT communities, populations, and peoples know how to formulate good public policy. a movement that has been created from the point of view of resistance in Stonewall, and that has had to face the challenges that it has, but has achieved what it has, clearly knows how to get the job done. And a movement that has had to answer to the diversity of voices and lived realities that reside within the Rainbow acronym is a movement that understands about participative politics. And the most important lesson that I learned throughout this process is that that experience ought to be capitalized upon. Political participation is a must, both from the point of those that are going to be impacted by public policy, but also to capitalize on this rich wealth, this enormous wealth of experience that resides within the LGBT movement. And the capacity of reaction of the movement allows me to conclude that the LGBT movement would be able to make incredible contributions to building back better. Thank you so much.
Well, all that remains time for is for me to say thank you. Thank you, Victor, for all the work you've done on these issues and for this inspiring talk. Thank you to the audience for all of your great contributions. Thank you all for listening. Be well. Thank you.